Careful, this video will contain major spoilers for Fire and Blood. If you not have yet picked up the book or have dawned it upon your ears, go ahead and skip this video and save it for later. For everyone else, well, you're in for a motherfucking treat! George R.R. Martin has done it again and yet further expanded on his amazing world of A Song of Ice and Fire. This time focusing on my favorite family, House Targaryen of the Valyrian Freehold. In this video, I want to discuss some of the more insane aspects that have stuck out to me. Now don't get it wrong, I haven't even finished this book yet because it's 700 pages. I'm about halfway through and I want to discuss some of the most interesting parts up to what I've read thus far. Now there was so much information to take in, this video isn't really going to super hyper focus on one subject, and it's more or less going to consist of me talking about several different things that I think may relate to the end game of Game of Thrones Season 8. Mainly, the fate of one Daenerys Targaryen. And also, towards the end of this video, I mentioned a leak that is to be taken with a grain of salt that may heavily pertain to the end game of Game of Thrones. Before we get started, please slap a like on this video as the like goal is going to be 422. Also, make sure you're subscribed and then make sure you have your notifications turned on so that way you get alerted every single time I drop a Game of Thrones video throughout this long night. Also, if you enjoyed this Fire and Blood content, make sure you leave a comment down below letting me know. Now, when I first dived into this book, I'm like, awesome. This is going to chronicle my favorite family of Westeros and really all of the Game of Thrones. The dragons are part of the main reason why I got into this story. Well, that and titties. That aside, like everything in this universe, it's so much deeper than that. First, we learn about the rule of Aegon the Conqueror, leading all the way up into his death, and then we pick up with his sons, Maegor and Aenys the First. Now these two brothers, or the Sons of the Dragons as they're called, could not be any different. It seems what a common theme in the Targaryen family is, because they're so interbred, is you don't really know how a Targaryen, when they're born, how their mental state is going to be. There's a common saying in Westeros that when you flip a coin, and a Targaryen's board, there's like a 50-50 chance that they'll be batshit insane or they'll be relatively normal. I don't even know if it's that consistent. I think it's more so Targaryens have such an inbred history that their mental health and their mental wellness can flip at any second. And no, I'm not about to turn this video into, oh, this is how Daenerys' end game is going to be. Fire and Blood lets you predict it. She's going to be a mad queen. She's going to end the same way as Maegor. No, not at all. What I'm really just trying to say here is that given the certain circumstances, a Targaryen can be a piss poor queen or king, but also if given the right circumstances, they can be the greatest thing for the Seven Kingdoms, i.e. Jaehaerys the Conciliator. One thing that can be said about Daenerys, though, is that if you look towards her past history and her past family members, we can take away that when they become scorned, that famous Targaryen pride rises up and they all make rash decisions, given whether they are wise, beyond their years, or just in general feeling cooped up. Every single Targaryen has that in them. Now, if we take into consideration what Daenerys has going into Season 8, well, I definitely think it's fair to say that she's going to make some rash decisions that could cause her to lose some very close allies. But before we get into all that Season 8 goodness, there's a lot more we need to discuss about Fire and Blood. Mainly, and I'm probably going to do a video on this in and of its entirety, but I want to propose one of my first tinfoil theories after partly reading Fire and Blood. That being the creation of dragons themselves. Now, Sir Hans beseech to you. I think I used that word right, but Aerea Targaryen. Now, just for a refresher course, Aerea Targaryen is the daughter of Prince Aegon the Uncrowned and Rhaena. Queen Rhaena, I should say, and we learn a lot about her, that being Rhaena in Fire and Blood. Now, Aerea Targaryen actually had a twin sister. They were pretty much complete opposites. Her sister, Rhaella, was more of a bookworm, and she was eventually sent away to Old Town, or Hightower rather, in order to study and enhance her knowledge and faith of the Seven. Princess Arya, on the other hand, was a wild child. She took to basically rebelling against everything her mother, Queen Rhaena, had said. Now, their situation in A Song of Ice and Fire is one of the most fucked up that I've had the pleasure of reading. Just to sort of cut it short here, Rhaena and Aegon, Princess Arya's parents, they grew up basically thinking that they were going to be next in line for the throne. With Aegon the Uncrowned, or I guess technically he would be Aegon the Second, but he never actually wore the crown. So Aegon the Uncrowned being Aenys the First, who is the son of Aegon the Conqueror. Oh man, that was a mouthful. But basically, they felt that they had the rightful claim to the throne. But instead, Queen Visenya, on hearing the news of Aenys the First's Death, who actually is her nephew, but on hearing the news of that, she flew straight to the Iron Keep and declared that Maegor the Cruel, who was over in exile at the time, was going to be the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. He's the son of the dragon, and he's way stronger than Aenys, therefore he has the power to claim the Iron Throne. Oh man, I feel like I'm getting super sidetracked here, but anyway, Maegor the Cruel, of course, takes the throne, not before competing in what is possibly the most badass trial by 7 ever, resulting in him getting hit so hard that his helm was smashed. Super side note, I think his helmet getting smashed is what ultimately gave him CTE and caused him to be maybe such a cruel person. But thus began the rule of Maegor the Cruel. One of the first things he did was slay Aegon the Uncrowned in a battle. And Aegon the Uncrowned is Arya Targaryen's father. And remember, that's who I initially wanted to talk about, but went on this massive tangent. I feel like I need to explain her backstory in order for us to get this a little bit more. But with that, there's some shit that happens in between there, but ultimately Rhaena, who is Arya Targaryen's mother, she becomes what is known as a Black Bride. Maegor actually had 3 of these. Now, after killing her husband, Aegon the Uncrowned, in a battle, Maegor keeps Rhaena and her daughter Arya at King's Landing until Rhaena hears that her younger brother Jaehaerys has taken up a claim for the Iron Throne. Then one night, they quickly escape on the back of her dragon, Dreamfire. Okay, now if I went into the detail explaining what happened to them over the next part, this video would be about 32 minutes long. So just a super loose summarize here, and remember, if you guys want, I will go into full detail about every single character in Fire and Blood. Just let me know down below in the comment section. But after flocking to Jaehaerys' side, it's quickly realized that he is going to be the conciliator, the greatest Targaryen king of all time. In my opinion, I think George wrote him after a very famous Egyptian pharaoh by the name of Ramses the Great. But it ends up getting to a point where Rhaena has everyone around her poisoned by her husband. Then her husband's sister and close concubine, Alyssa Fairman, ends up stealing 3 dragon eggs from Dragonstone and escapes across the Narrow Sea. Sure enough, she ends up selling these dragon eggs to a spicemonger over in Essos. It's very heavily insinuated that those dragon eggs are going to fossilize, and these are the same ones that Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal are all born from hundreds of years later to Daenerys Targaryen. Now, Alyssa was not only greatly admired by Rhaena, but also by her daughter, Arya, and her leaving was the last straw that broke the camel's back in the relationship between Arya and her mother, Rhaena. There were stories that Arya was so rebellious, she hated living on Dragonstone, and she basically wanted to return to King's Landing. She got to be closer with the dragons, which she did enjoy about being on Dragonstone, but ultimately she enjoyed seeing the sights and sounds of the city. She wanted to go back to King's Landing. So if my timeline's correct in remembering all this, once Rhaena returns to Dragonstone from King's Landing after just having told her younger brother Jaehaerys about how the 3 dragon eggs were just stolen, she quickly finds out that her daughter had left. Not only did she leave, but she also stole a dragon. And not just any dragon, but Balerion the Black Dread. Balerion was said to be the biggest dragon to ever have lived. And by the time Aegon used him to conquer the 7 kingdoms, and this takes place, which is about 47 years after Aegon's conquest, Balerion was such an ancient and massive dragon, there was no hope really that Arya, who had never ridden a dragon until that point, had any chance of controlling him. And this is where the story gets super tragic. Archmaester Gillidan claims that no one really knows what happened when Princess Arya took off on Balerion the Black Dread. She was gone for about a year before making a sudden reappearance. Now, it's hinted at in the books as well as by Archmaester Gillidan that the Targaryens share some sort of special bond with their dragons. A lot of the times, dragons will take on the mood of their riders. Now, that part's extremely important. I'm going to come back to it here in a second. What was Arya's mood, you might ask, when she hopped on Balerion the Black Dread's back? Was that she wanted to go home. In her mind, her home was King's Landing. Not to old buddy Balerion. He's an ancient Targaryen dragon who hailed from the Valyrian freehold. So this theory states by Archmaester Gillidan that Balerion flew her to her ancestral home. After the doom of Valyria and the Targaryens left many years ago, no one really knows what the hell is going on over there. But one thing can be said is that when she was brought back, nothing the likes of what happened to her had ever been seen by anyone ever before. And it's stated that centuries later, no one is even closer to knowing what truly happened to Arya Targaryen and Balerion. Upon Arya's sudden reemergence, she's greeted by a knight once she lands. Now, she stumbles off the back of Balerion and mentions, "I never," and never really gets out the words before she passes out. The knight who carries her to the maesters, is said that her skin is so hot, he could feel it through his plated armor. Maester Bennifer, the dude who was in charge of basically trying to heal Arya, usually keeps a very detailed record on every single thing. He sends hundreds of letters back to the Citadel on what happens in his day-to-day life serving under Jaehaerys. The events that followed, there was no record of this from him. Instead, they pretty much rely on Septon Bath's testimony. And this dude was freaking traumatized from what he saw. I know, you're like, dude, you said you were going to talk about how this pertains to Daenerys in the End Game, and I'm getting there, but I gotta share this with you guys. I feel traumatized from having heard about it super third hand, so I need to share with somebody. Septon Bath goes on to mention how when they first received Aerea Taragaryen, now I do want to make a side note that these names are of a British dialect, and I'm pretty sure I'm not saying them right at all. But anyway, once they received her, Septon Bath mentions how he went to touch her brow just to feel how hot her skin was, and he said it was the same as plunging his hand in a vat of hot oil. When he looked at her flesh, there was barely any there. It was almost as if most of it had been rotted away, sort of like she had been starved for some time. Much to their dismay, they tried everything, but nothing would work. They even gave her milk of the poppy, and that didn't even touch the pain. It got to the point where she was basically cooking from the inside. Her skin got so fucking dark that it resembled pork crackling. Homegirl's eyes liquefied in her face. Now you're probably like, what the hell? All the fever's causing that? No, the part that I've been waiting to mention is the fact that she had worms crawling around inside her. Basically, her stomach would extrude and then it would go back in. These worms were literally burning her from the inside out. It got to the point where the only thing they could do, or they could think of to do, was that to calm her temperature, they would put her in an ice bath. When they did this, she immediately died. They assumed her heart stopped as soon as she touched the water. Basically, she stopped moving, but the things inside of her did not. Septon Bath had mentioned that all the while they were doing, all of their experiments and stuff and trying to cure her, that the worms or the things inside of her had appeared as if though they're trying to look for a way out, and they're burning her to try to find a way to get out. Once they dropped her in that ice bath, they got out, and when they got out and touched that cold ice water, they started shriveling up and shrinking. The description of them is worms with faces, no longer than a fingernail were some of them, but some of them were as long as one of the maester's arms. Now, to my knowledge, there has been nothing quite like this story in anything in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, nothing quite like this. When you do research, the closest thing you can come to something sort of similar to this description is a fireworm. And I mean sort of, because what we do know about fireworms has nothing to do with them crawling inside the body of a living person. For the most part, we know that the Valyrian sheep herders found them inside the 14 Flames, basically the caves that they dug in order to hatch their dragons and also mine for precious materials. Nothing is mentioned of them eating human flesh or barricading themselves inside the human body. But I will say what Septon Bath saw inspired him to make a book about the unnatural history of dragons, wyverns, and fireworms. In that book, he mentions how he thinks that dragonkin may have been created using wyverns in some sort of black magic sorcery. Wait, this is Game of Thrones, I mean blood magic. Whatever may be the actual case, there's definitely some sort of chimera type situation going on between the dragons, the Valyrians, and fire itself. One thing that's pretty interesting though is that it's mentioned that fireworms often, after they would encounter these Valyrian slavers, there would be charred corpses that were found nearby. Now, it's not mentioned that the fireworms were actually eating these corpses, but it's said that they have no love for men. But when you combine that information of a charred corpse with what we learned from Septon Bath about Princess Arya, there's definitely some information that's being kept secret for us relating to fireworms, Targaryens, and them being able to control their dragons. Now, it's 100% possible that Balerion flew off to Valyria and went off to a cave, and while he was gone, Arya being by herself, she was attacked by a fireworm. It is mentioned that when Balerion came back with Arya, he was wounded as well. And something as big and as massive and as ancient as Balerion, if something can wound him pretty badly as it was, as in his blood was still dripping when he landed, then there was some sort of altercation. What happened over there? We may never know. But what is hinted at is the fact that there was some sort of manipulation by the Children of Fire, the Targaryens, descendants of the Valyrian Freehold, in order to create the weapon of fire, the dragons. Now, when you look at the TV show, a similar ritual, we could say, was used in order to create the White Walkers. Now, what we were shown was a man tied up against a tree with his shirt removed and the children of the forest whispering some sort of information back and forth to each other before they ultimately go and stab him in the chest, therefore creating the first White Walker, or the Night King. Now, we're only shown part of that ritual, but I guarantee you that there was some other bits that was sort of left out. I don't know if we'll ever get to see it on the TV show, but I'm sure it will be expanded upon in the novels. Now, the information for Game of Thrones Season 8 has been extremely scarce in the sense that we're less than 6 months away and we've really not gotten too much official information. One thing we have gotten is a marketing campaign titled #ForTheThrone. Now, initially when that promo came out, it was just a bunch of recycled footage from previous seasons organized in the way to make you think that this final season is going to be all about the Game of Thrones. Now, most of us seasoned viewers know that that's a lie. The final season is mostly, or in our minds at least, going to be about the battle of the Army of the Dead and the Army of the Living. However, after reading the first half of Fire and Blood, I think that that may be wrong. We've seen what kind of damage Daenerys' dragons can do to the undead. They're ultimately a pile of walking bones, and for the most part, they can't really think for themselves, and the Night King sort of dictates their every move. We are for sure going to be promised, in my opinion, some massive Army of the Dead versus the Army of the Living fight scenes, including a fight scene between Daenerys and the Night King himself, both of them being on the back of dragons. We're going to get that. But the main plot of Season 8 may surprise us all when the end game we realize that the Game of Thrones is still being played heavily. Now, I can say this till I'm blue in the face, which is that history repeats itself and things that happen in the past of A Song of Ice and Fire will most likely happen in the future, and that still holds truth. Season 7 set up a lot of different events. One of the main things that it set up was the fact that Tyrion is bound to betray Daenerys. Now, spoilers aside, all of the clues are there. In episode 2 of Season 7, Olenna warns Daenerys that she should put aside the plans of clever men, and she's a dragon, so she should act like one. Then also in episode 7 of Season 7, we have Tyrion outright having a conversation with Cersei. In the very beginning of the conversation, he mentions to her that he is the only one who is actively trying to save their family. Just before then, he mentions to Jon Snow how a little lie can save them a lot of face. Now, there's still a chance that Tyrion is just trying to play Cersei into his hands, and by telling her that he's trying to do everything he can in his power to save her family, but for the most part, he loves her children. And after Cersei tells her that he's with child, Tyrion is likely going to do everything in his power to, if not save Cersei, at least save that last baby Lannister. One thing that Targaryens are good for is playing the Game of Thrones until their bitter end. And yes, I do realize that we were just talking about Tyrion, but honestly, after reading the first half of Fire and Blood, I'm pretty sure that the Targaryens and everyone who had some sort of direct connection to dragon blood intermingled with the entire kingdom, and I would not be surprised if I'd say a good third of Westeros has some sort of lineage that they can trace back to the blood of the dragon. So you know that secret super tinfoil theory that everyone in Game of Thrones is a secret Targaryen? That's actually probably the case, more so than we even realize it. So with that being said, one thing that's for certain is that the Army of the Dead will be destroyed and most likely taken care of. I don't agree with the theory that there will have to be a replacement for the Night King in order to keep some sort of balance, but that is a small possibility. In my opinion, in Game of Thrones Season 8, the Night King would have been dealt with by episode 4. This leaves about 2.5 episodes to conclude the events of a Game of Thrones, to which this show is named, so there's no way they're going to go out with every character not still playing the Game of Thrones, in one way or another. Now, this next part will contain potential spoilers for Game of Thrones Season 8, so go ahead and click out of the video right now if you don't want to know anything. Now, this is to be taken with a grain of salt and is more for entertainment. The only reason why I'm bringing it up in this video is because it sort of pertains to this information from Fire and Blood. So at some point next season, Jon, after following the advice of Tyrion to go and meet with Cersei in secret in hopes of completely destroying any sort of war that may happen between her and Daenerys, Jon agrees to meet with Cersei in secret and is immediately killed shortly upon arriving. Little to Cersei's dismay, Jon Snow is not actually killed. It isn't revealed that Jon Snow actually survived this altercation until after the worst is done. Daenerys, upon hearing of this information, immediately throws Tyrion in a cell and takes off on her dragon. She then rides straight to King's Landing and burns the entire city, unintentionally setting off wildfire, which completely wipes out King's Landing and everyone in it. It is later revealed that Daenerys did not fly to King's Landing with the hopes of burning the entire city. Instead, she wanted to burn Cersei and watch as her corpse charred and turned to ashes. But apparently, according to this leaker, her rage makes her lose control of her dragon, and this is why Drogon destroys the entire city after setting off a clutch of wildfire. Then, and this is where the leak, air quotations there, really falls apart, is that Daenerys, feeling so grief-stricken with the death of Jon Snow and the death of everything she's fought for, she has Drogon firebomb dive into the flames, and she is burned up by the wildfire, thus ending the reign of the Targaryens. So apparently that would leave Jon Snow as the one true heir who eventually sits the Iron Throne. Now, I don't really agree with that at all. I think Daenerys should be the one to survive in the end, but if you look at it from a more poetic stance in that it's about a Song of Ice and Fire, so the end game has to bring balance to Ice and Fire, that balance comes through Jon Snow, whose parents are Ice and Fire, and I can kind of see that happening. However, I sort of feel like with Targaryen back history of not really having one without the other, sort of all or nothing kind of thing, I think either they both survive and have no children, or they both die and their children survives. Another reason why I brought this leak up and just sort of mentioned in this video is the fact that we do know that according to Archmaester Gillidan, dragons can project what the riders are feeling. So if that's the case, then this leak has a little bit of credibility, and I mean a little bit. Alright, I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you could please slap a like on this video, the like goal is going to be 420. I do appreciate you sitting with me through this 20-minute video. There will be many more of these based on Fire and Blood information, so I do hope you guys enjoy this. Please make sure you're subscribed and make sure you have your notifications turned on so that way you get alerted every single time I drop a Game of Thrones video throughout this long night. Super special shout out to every single member of my Patreon family over on patreon.com/SirHuntsReviews, and super special shout out to every single person who's watching this video right now. I want to thank you all again so much. My name's Mark, and this has been Sir Hunts Reviews.